Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Dr. Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strictly Facts. But you hear a new voice today.
Hooray!
This is a Breadfruit Family crossover episode with Style and Vibes. So today I am your host, Michaela from Style and Vibes. If you have not checked out that podcast, make sure you guys check it out. I talk all things music, bridging the gap between the past and the current. And Strictly Facts is also produced by Breadfruit Media. And so we are family. And so today, I know you guys have heard a lot about, or maybe you haven't. So Alexandria, I don't know how much you've told the people them about your dissertation. So so when I rap with education around here, and so she have
True,
further our education.
true.
So I've aligned the studies and the creativity together, so make them go on. So your dissertation is about women in reggae. Talk to me a little bit about what inspired you to study women in reggae and why you made that your dissertation.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, Michaela. It was also so interesting to not intro my own podcasts for once. So this is fun. I think my listeners over the years over on the Strictly Facts side. So thanks everybody for tuning in to another episode. They've heard me talk about, I think maybe talk around it and certainly express my love for reggae throughout several episodes. I think it was a lot to do and put my mind to. So now I feel like it's finally done. I'm officially Dr. Alex. And now I can put it really to the fore and just really want to share it with you all. I think first and foremost, what really brought me to this study of reggae is how much reggae has meant to me in my life. I think we always talk about, growing up listening to our parents, music, right? It would in I car in the car seat and I literally can remember my parents playing a Maxi Priest cassette in our like 90 something Honda Accord and those being some of my earliest memories of reggae and of music, right? And then of course, we have the berries pane Saturday when we are clean and all these things. But I think for me, um what really cemented this as being what I wanted to study and spend what amounted to 7 years of my life working on and writing, was ultimately that there's so much work on reggae. There's so many studies on reggae. And in a lot of ways, it's gendered, right? If you were to sit here and say, Alex, name a book on Bob Marley, I could go on for hours, right? In a sense, and it's not necessarily the same equivalent for women. And I think as I came to understand myself and who I am as a person and my love for history and for the culture, of course, and for bridging the two of them together, that was something that I really wanted to contribute to, right? I think even when we think of the reggae revival in the like 2010s, that was a very important moment for me personally, being like, here we have a generation of artists who are roughly my age, kind of championing and carrying forward what that sort of golden era of reggae artists were doing in the 70s and 80s. And, here I am saying, we have people now who are also carrying this forward. How can we bridge our understanding of the two together?
Over the years, what do you think you have found that has been the most surprising?
Surprising, surprising, surprising. I think um there are a lot of moments where women are referenced, right? There are a lot of moments where women are sometimes at the footnotes of these histories without us really having a grounded understanding of their contributions. I think of people like Sonia Pottinger, right? Jamaica's first female producer in many ways. And I think there's a decent amount of people who will know that tagline, right? Sonia Pottinger, Jamaica's first female producer. But do we know the extent to which, her career shaped the careers of many people within reggae who, went on to lead and have amazing careers themselves, right? It's these undercurrents of support of women who are doing a lot of the work behind the scenes in addition, right? That I think is certainly important for how we understand who we are as a people, as a culture, and how the culture continues to then move forward.
Why do you think that we hear so few about women and to your point, the idea of they're kind of mentioned in the footnote, historically speaking?
I think if we even take it out of the context of reggae specifically, doing the like work of history telling, right? Like writing history is oftentimes very gendered. I think when we think of the like main contributors to history, they're typically men, right? They're typically these male leaders or politicians, etc. And so very similarly to a sense in reggae, right? When that history then gets documented, it is in the sense of those, male mega artists and things like that. And I think there is this sort of like distinction between what we or something that I try to sort of embody and describe in my work as like needing to understand what resistance looks like and the different kinds of resistance in the same way that we might say how do we not necessarily compare, but, a revolution of enslaved people, right, is resistance in the same way that a woman might say, she's gonna play sick and not go out in the fields today. You might consider them on two different levels of resistance, right? But there's still resistance nonetheless. And I think in a similar way, we have to sort of approach that understanding of our reggae history in that sense that it's, a facet of who and what does resistance look like, and how that impacts the value we put on our music. I also think, to add a sort of addendum to that, there is a way that the mass and very public resistance of women in dancehall has sort of also affected our understanding of women in reggae, right? I think specifically of books by like Carolyn Cooper, one of my own advisors, Donna Hope, even a recent book by Patricia Saunders called Buyers Beware, looking at women, the politics of pleasure and sexuality, and the empowerment that women have gotten through that when we think of people like a Lady Saw, right, or like a Spice. And while women in reggae may not necessarily be doing that same sort of work, there is one that sort of gets heightened over the other because of the public facingness, the sort of in your faceness, if I may, of it. And I think sort of these are all questions that affect the status of women in reggae.
What do you think are some of, like, the through line challenges that women in reggae have really, um, gone through in terms of what are the challenges and have they gotten better is the question, really.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on one hand, we have generally this sort of situation where producers are often the ones who, when we think of a rhythm, right? A rhythm gets created. Who are the people that are going to amass the wealth of the rhythms? Oftentimes, it's that sort of producer dynamic, but we have to also understand that there's a gendered vulnerability in the ways that our music industry really has created itself. I've interviewed several women in reggae, right, who have said, there's been sort of like a gendered intimidation where they approach a producer and say, well, I did contribute to writing this song, my name should be on the royalties. And they're like, me try ya $1,000 or whatever, right? Whereas, that's an immediate solution, right? A small fix, but that's not necessarily going to carry them forward when we think of things like royalties that are over time, right? Of course, I think we can't have a conversation about the challenges women face without talking about sexual harassment and how that has affected women's careers. And I think certainly another thing that is really important is the level of intimate relationships and partnerships within the industry. I don't think it's not necessarily particular to Jamaican music that, singers, artists, producers work together, spend hours together, then end up in romantic relationships, etc., together. But then if it becomes a time where there's a couple and they have a baby, who's oftentimes bearing the brunt of, you know, the labor, the care, work, et cetera, for the child, right? It's usually the women. And so who then has to sacrifice potentially their careers and step away, right? It tends to not be the man. And so these, I think, are all just, a handful of different things that have impacted women's careers. And I think the legal challenges around Jamaica's sort of copyright laws are things that people have, several scholars have talked about for years, but it's one that I think also specifically really targets women when we think about, how women, maybe later on in their lives tend to try to seek legal recourse. I think specifically when we think of like Sister Nancy's Bam Bam, right? That is like, to me, one of the very most significant, but like few cases where we see a woman getting sort of that legal recourse to get royalties for one of her songs. There are so many different cases like that that don't necessarily come to the fore, but she is one of the few that has actually been able to do so.
That's a lot to unpack because I think you hit on quite a few of the challenges, and like you said, they are pretty gendered.
Mhm.
But the one that really kind of stuck out is the royalties and the splits of how music is made. Do you find that women are becoming more savvy from a business perspective? And how has that really impacted their ability to be successful in the industry from what you see?
Yeah, I think, we live in this digital age, right, where there's, of course, a mass of information readily available at our fingertips. And so, when I've spoken to some, elder women in my work, and they've been like, I had no idea how a contract would work, or I didn't have any idea about how royalties would work. They might have just like shoved this paper at me and told me to go sign it, and then, I got in the studio. We have so much available now to be like, I don't know what this word means in this contract, or, sort of like ways of pseudo seeking like legal advice via Google or whatever it is, right? That I think artists today are certainly benefiting from. And I think more than probably ever before, you see a very like concerted effort of women to own their own music, right? Create their own labels. Whereas before it was, we I got Studio One, or we're going to these big sort of labels to put our music out there. There definitely is a really concerted effort of independence and independent ownership that might not always translate to you being like big time and being one of the most, renowned artists per se, but at least you own what's yours and you're not, sort of doing what I was talking about before in terms of struggling to get royalties and what so forth.
You kind of talked about women behind the scenes in terms of there are a few, but I feel like there are more.
There is so many.
There are more public facing figures than
Mhm.
there are those behind the scenes, and those behind the scenes are particularly relegated to jobs like event planning, PR, marketing. But the production, publishing, business strategy, growth, that still tends to be male driven. What do you think it would take for women to be more dominant in those particular spaces?
I think they are working together. I think I might even argue that, like, I do agree that there's obviously a hierarchy to the sort of behind the scenes roles, right? That there are certainly more women in maybe like a PR, right? And management dynamic than VP of insert record label or something. But I think of the women who are doing this work together, there's certainly a concerted effort to work together, and that practice of sort of like these informal networks and cooperation, I think is something that was really foregrounded from Sonia Pottinger, right? There are so many interviews of people talking about Sonia Pottinger where they call it her maternal instinct, right? And her ability to produce music, support artists, and, you know, work together in a way that feels like fair for lack of a better way of framing, right? And I think, to more directly answer your question, um, it I think goes back to this point of ownership, right? That, the more women that are particularly maybe like owning their own labels, they're owning their own music that then generates a sort of system where women are working together, and then allowing each other to not only, support one another, but then in addition, we do see more ownership, more women in these sort of higher positions that you're trying to get at.
I think one thought that I had was you talk a lot about Sonia Pottinger, but I'm like, where's the next Sonia Pottinger?
Mm.
You know? And that I think is kind of sparking something within in this conversation that I think could be missing. And I think to your point, ownership could drive that. There are so many similarities between dancehall, reggae, Caribbean music,
Mhm.
and hip hop, and I'm like, where are our moguls from? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like they've been like very similar mainstay for quite a long time, and there's no turning of the guard, if you will, and that isn't women specific, but I do think that there is a huge opportunity to fill that space particularly through ownership. So I think a lot of women like Jamaica, it not short of talent, it's not short of talent at all. But I think the behind the scenes, like, definitely has the biggest opportunity to grow. And I think that is what is needed to see more growth in the music from a global reach perspective, because I think the music itself has legs and no one can really deny the talent. But I think there lies an opportunity to drive the growth, and not just culturally, but from a financial impact as well. Like, I see reggae and dancehall as a cultural export of Jamaica. You know what I mean? So why should it not be um making money the way that other industries are? And we could totally go off on a tangent on that before I bring it back. But from that perspective, in terms of global recognition, I think every year we talk about the Grammys a lot,
Mm.
and there's always conversation around recognition. Very few women have won the Reggae Grammy or even been nominated. To be completely transparent, what do you think winning at that level? Coffee has won, Puma from
Yeah,
Black
Puma Jones.
Uhuru won previously, and
Mhm.
like that, and then I think when you think of how frequently women are even coming. I mean, the reggae to me isn't necessarily a litmus test of the success of women
Right.
in particular. What do you think moments like that really energy-wise put back into the culture and the growth of the music as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think while I would agree with you, right, that, we shouldn't use winning a Grammy as the litmus test for, a great artist. There's a whole array of complications around that. Um, but I think there is a sort of global awareness that that does offer for artists. I think in this way, like Coffee's win to me, I think generated a lot of discussion around gender, in reggae in the industry where people were suddenly like, "Oh, Coffee's the first woman to win solo." So, as you said, Puma won as part of Black Guru, but Coffee was the first woman to win the reggae as a solo art or for a solo project rather. Um but I think that the same sort of energy that we put towards this sort of global awareness could also even apply to, as we were talking about before, the women behind the scenes, right? I feel like we can't talk about certain events and um, very critical moments within our culture without being aware that people oftentimes like Sharon Burke of Solid Agency, coordinated them, right? Ronnie Tomlinson from Destiny Media coordinated things like Buju's Long Walk to Freedom tour. There's a particular way that I think the Grammys allows for global recognition, but I think we within ourselves need to sort of capitalize and um certainly just be more aware of these moments that go viral, right? But it's not just, oh, the artist put this on himself or herself, right? There are so many hands behind what goes into this work that I think the Grammys is a quick one, right? The Grammys might be the easiest one, but it's not the end all be all. And we sort of need to be looking at ways to diversify our understandings of how we value and capitalize on these things.
So tell me a bit academically, how did you approach your dissertation? Like, what was your strategic approach of what you wanted to include? For those who have never done a dissertation, can you tell me a little bit more about that process and how you were kind of uh, writing and thinking about how you wanted to present women in reggae as part of your academic completion?
Mhm. So there are years where I have to like actually take classes first and I'm not fully writing the thing, right? So this is sort of like much later in my academic career, but I think one thing that was really important to me was I'm a historian by trade, right? And so one thing that was sort of my first immediate step was to go to the archives, right? And so I spent a lot of time in the National Library in Kingston, even going through like archives at Tuff Gong, et cetera, and seeing what was there. And not only what was there, but also sort of paying attention to what was missing, right? And so I remember like even going into the National Library and telling them I'm trying to do this project and what is here, right? Like what is and when I say what is here, I mean sort of like in terms of like newspaper clippings or just, random things that they've saved throughout Jamaican history. And again, there is a massive wealth on male artists and then these sort of like very limited folders on women, right? That are often limited to, one or two newspaper articles that somebody saved and these things like that. So I think from there, and, in a lot of ways, because a decent number of these women are still living, I was able to contact people and conduct oral histories with them, where I was able to ask them about their experiences, not just, you know, as artists, but more so how it's impacted their lives, right? Had to then transcribe that. It's a whole thing to go from actually, contacting a person, them agreeing to do the interview, transcribing, as, I'm sure we can all imagine. Um, Transcription takes a really long time, especially if we're in a vibe and we're talking in patois, because there is no way that the AI or whatever somebody else would suggest me to use for, the transcription is going to catch how we speak in that sense, right? And maybe I guess it might do a little bit better now. Like, they're working on patois and all these different things in the AI, but um it was a sort of important for me to sort of do those things by hand and catch the moments where, somebody goes, like, I know so it did go, right? And that's not something that to me AI will understand because I understand what that means in a particular way. um, what else was a part of my project? I did a lot of work in terms of sort of what scholars might call close readings or textual analysis. And what I mean by that is me sort of taking various songs and lyrics as important texts and how they document moments within our history and also using that to like draw parallels, right? And so, for instance, one of the things that I do in that's my fourth chapter is bringing together songs thematically, and seeing how these themes have either evolved over time or, shaped and, have become very critical in terms of the work of that women do in reggae. And so, for instance, like I think Carlene Davis has a song called Ism Schism that I sort of point to in a very similar aspect to several songs, but, to take it to, like, a more recent, artist, Lila Ike has a song called Wanted, right? I use sort of those 2 songs, for our conversation today just to sort of point to the ways that, like, violence, within our communities shapes and impacts women particularly, right? And I think in both of those songs, for instance, and they're several decades apart at that, right, are really undergirding the challenges that women face not only in their families, but also in communities where, we have to worry about violence, gendered violence, intimate partner violence, for instance, right? There are all of these different dynamics. And I think when that was sort of one of my goals through that sort of close reading is to sort of bridge parallels and talk about how women's music has really evolved, and what things have sort of become more ingrained and more popular overall.
You said a whole lot, and I'm glad I wrote my notes. The one comment I think is around not enough archival work around women. So for me, as a journalist, podcast host who talks about these things, I'm happy that I actually will be part of a future archive because I have so many conversations. So hopefully, when this is studied years from now, it will resonate. So I'm excited to be part of that history. And you mentioned contacting artists for oral history. Can you share who you spoke with?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. All right.
Some of the people who I spoke with include like a Norma Fraser, right? Susan Cadogan, in terms of sort of like early women in the genre who to me spoke to their experiences at length. I think one thing I oftentimes think about when I think of Susan Cadogan is that in the early 80s, she had this song called Hurt So Good that was immensely popular on local radio, right? And she's flying out to the UK to do shows and all of these things, but then ultimately, like, keeps her job. She was working at the time at, UWI's library and keeps her job at UWI library and is just like, "Oh, hey guys, I'm gonna take a month off because I have to go do these shows in London," right? But then comes back and goes back to her job because in a very earnest sense, these are going back to the point that I made about some of the financial challenges, right? Of,
I know some
royalties,
artists
of
today
YouTube.
that still do that. So that's
Exactly,
that
right,
they just got a head start on.
right. And so I think like that to me are unforgettable in the sense of just like being able to carve that story out and say what that means, not just for this, one individual person, right? But how it sort of exemplifies these sort of greater structural issues that we're understanding for women within the genre.
As you were doing this research, like did anything like really surprise you?
Hmm. Um, I think the surprises came from the moments where women talk about how other women have been very supportive of their careers, right? Because I think that's not an immediate question that always gets asked. I think it goes back to this like women are competition, whatever, whatever thing. And we have a clash culture and this year one better than this year one as an artist, et cetera, et cetera. But to hear women talk about and especially like, intergenerationally specifically, right? Where women today have been like, Marcia Griffiths pulled me aside and said that she loved my set and did all these things, right? Those moments I think are really particular and something that I wanted to capture because it's not always this story that we get that women are against each other, quote unquote, right? Women are certainly doing the work of mentorship, of alignment, of working together, of collaboration, cooperation. And I think that's something that we need to support and uplift more.
I love that. I think what is interesting about that is sharing experiences is important, and I think that there is this negative narrative around women can't work together when we see pods of women. I think that the emphasis from a media standpoint is always on the negative, and I think it kind of fuels the fire a bit, rather than focusing on the positives that really kind of come into play. From a content perspective, in terms of the lyrical content, how has their, like, femininity really played a role in how they approach the music that they put out? I mean, we see the sensual right up to the raunchy and everything in between, so would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's one that certainly has evolved and changed over time, right? When we think of women like the I3 who that brings me to a whole nother point because they get often pitted as just the backup singers to Bob Marley and the Wailers, and they were so much more. And for those who are unfamiliar, the I3 comprised of Rita Marley, Judy Mowatt, and Marcia Griffiths. And they were all women who had careers and were doing music from even before they joined the Wailers, right? But I think to get back to the point of, femininity and sort of presentation, there was a point that was sort of Black power in a sense, of course, right? When we see the colors that they adorned, right? The African prints that were part of their performances oftentimes, but it was still sort of living within a sort of respectability politics, if you will, right? The skirts are, um, you know, such length and all of these things, which I think gets complicated based off, you know, Rastafari and how Rastafari views gendered and views women oftentimes. But I do definitely see an evolution today where, it is acceptable to be, um, as you were saying, sensual, right? It's okay to embody a sort of dynamic that I think is a little bit different than, what was seen in the 70s and 80s. I think the interesting thing about today's generation is for people who are my age and, similarly, who maybe love reggae, right? But you also grew up in a dance hall dominating ethos, right? So there is this sort of dynamic for I think the women today where they're like, I can do both, like or really saying like, why can't I do both, right? I can be political in my music. I can um uphold these certain dynamics or these certain beliefs or whatever. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm quote unquote less than because my skirt is such length or it has to be to my ankles for me to be seen as important or valued, right? I think there's a little bit more fluidity that we see today. And I think that's something that I certainly believe is in credit due to the sort of dancehall generation.
I think that's interesting, and you kinda touched on one point, and I think I'm thinking about it now because 'cause I'm reading this book, How to Say Babylon, so it's right here.
Yes, by
And I was
Sinclair.
and I thinking about that book in particular is really about the views of women from the perspective of a devout Rastafarian family. How do you think that that conservative view of women also widely do you think it's a thing where culture is reflected in the music or the music is pushing a certain culture? And I don't know that I have an answer or a thought, but it was a thought in my mind. I've never really thought about how the beliefs and views I mean, the music that we've heard has been so positive in terms of the consciousness and, like, the way that they kind of enshrine a Black woman
Mhm.
in the music versus the actual practice. Does it I don't know if you know where I'm going with
No,
this,
I
but
understand I understand what you mean. I don't know if I fully have an answer either, but I think the connection between reggae and Rastafari is one that is sort of getting at what you're getting at, right? That,
Mhm.
like, Rastafari comes up within the '30s. We see reggae then sort of as like a cultural offshoot or however you want to frame that as a result of these belief systems and practices that we have, right? And so it's inherent in a sense that the beliefs of Rastafari are then going to sort of impact some of the presentation of reggae. And I think that's sort of maybe where I'll take a middle ground answer. Um, I will say though that like in terms of Jamaican culture on a whole, right, there have been a lot of changes in terms of just this view of respectability, right? There was a time not too long ago actually where, you know, if you have locks you can't even get to work type of deal. And it's like Jamaica is the birth of Rastafari and we're, sort of from a hierarchical perspective, kind of bringing down these labels on people for their beliefs, for their presentation. I think that has certainly been something that's changed and is still changing, right? It's not 100% by any means, but that's kind of how I frame this understanding that as we are still evolving as a people, right? I think that sort of similar idea of beliefs and practices then continues to impact how the music is changing, right? So you can have people today who are and embodying, a reggae ethos that may not necessarily be practicing Rastafari, but they believe in the sort of black power of it, in the consciousness raising of it, and able to sort of move in and around and about um, the music in that sense.
Yeah, I definitely think as a country, conservative values and respectability politics have always kind of been at play. It might even be, some say, an offshoot of colonialism and
It is.
being
I
able
would say
to
so. It's the British fault. Not that,
it
not that we should only, like,
have
give them
standards that,
right,
yeah, come
right,
from
but
that.
but
Yeah,
also it's in part on us to change and evolve from that. So I won't say
right,
it's only them, but
right.
them did start it, so
Well, it's I say in part because I think even as a people as a community have standards, and as a community you have a collective belief system that allows for you to live together. So it's not that by any means we as a people didn't have standards before, but they are often shifted with the impact of colonialism, and there is almost like that next layer, and they don't get talked about separately,
yeah.
and I think that that is important to really understand the music, and it's like a lot of people from the outside looking in can't see how reggae and dancehall can sit in close proximity because if Jamaica no run pon nothing, it run pon time and place. And there's a time to be serious and a time to be conscious, and there is a time for broke out. And both have significantly paid their dues to being respectable in the society as a whole. And that respect really came from its global growth. And so, to me, also impacts the way that we think about success as reggae and dancehall grows is because the outside gave it the validation that it didn't come solely from just the people, and it took that outside validation for people to start to really respect it in a way that, either outside of the country or outside of the community, right? So if you look at how much like a Michael Manley really embraced, that, but he is of a different he is of a certain part of society where, you know what I mean? Like, it's not that it needed that validation, but that's what amplified it in a way. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's so tricky to really talk about, and it's exciting to kind of have this discussion with you. But I think it's also interesting from a historical perspective. Why is this important? Why now? Why did you want to do this beyond the personal connection to the music? What do you see is its importance in the historical reference to how people and societies view our music and our culture at large?
Yeah, I think, for me, it's primarily 2 things, right? I think firstly, we are in a time where there are so many thriving women in reggae between, Ajana and Alila Ike, Savannah, Jazalise, Naomi Cohen, right? Like I could keep going. And of course we can't forget our like late 90s, earlier 2000s. So Queen Ifrika, Etana, right? Like I think that mass to me is very special. And one that I think we can't fully understand the impact of without understanding the women that came before them, right? And I think that part gets sort of to my second impetus for this project is wanting to really understand how things like power and belonging impact our society, right? That like a lot of the work that I spend writing on, I'm labeling it in terms of sort of gendered labor that happens, right? That, we can't forget the fact that, while Bob Marley was an immense figure within himself, right? The reason we have the Bob Marley Museum, for instance, is because of the work that Rita did in terms of his estate and then, wanting to move it from just being one of their homes to like one of the most iconic places to visit in terms of like tourism within Jamaica, right? These are all different aspects of the story. You know, some people, and I think us as like implicit Jamaicans may know, right? But from like a more global perspective is largely under discussed or not talked about. And I just think, being able to pair these understandings of power, of creativity, of the gendered labor that goes into some of this work while also understanding that, the women today are still navigating some of the challenges that the earlier women faced. It helps us to round out our story about who we are as a people and, further helps us to decode what work still needs to be done. And so that's ultimately, what I aim to do as somebody who, as you said, right, loves the culture. I think my life story would be incomplete without it, and that was just sort of one of the ways that I wanted to give back to it.
Love that. That is the perfect place to end. Well, thank you, Alexandria. This was an amazing experience. I always enjoy talking to you about music, and you give me lots of history for go look fun. No, um, you know the thing. I'd love to hear more about your experience in Kingston doing that research as you were looking at the library and at Tough Gong. I think that that is so interesting. So if you have pictures, please share with the people them.
Oh,
Yes,
begging.
yes.
But, I mean, I'm giving myself a little break for this summer because 'cause it's been a long,
Intense.
long journey.
Yes, yes.
But my hope is to to start working in
Yeah.
publishing and, as you said, putting the things up online and stuff soon. So, everybody give me a time,
She soon
this is
come, but she
probably
not
the
tell you what
yeah, this
time.
is no, we're not telling you what time, but this is the first time I've actually, like, getting an academic break. I'm like, "Oh, I'll never go back to school again." Great. So, give me a little time. But, the hope is that all of this will be out soon for you all to check out as well.
Awesome. So you guys, of course, continue to listen to Strictly Facts in future episodes. Thank you for having me. So if you like Strictly Facts, also listen to Style and Vibes, please and
Which
thanks.
is right, which
Yes, yes. So thank you for having me as a guest host today on Strictly Facts.
Yes, thank you for being my interviewer today, Michaela. As she said, guys, for our, my Strictly Facts family tuning in, if you like this episode, if you love the reasoning with Michaela, because one thing about if we decide to get and record a podcast, we could have go on and on. So this really could have be several parts. But I certainly recommend wholeheartedly y'all tuning into Style and Vibes if you haven't already. The Breadfruit Media family is very big, very strong, very collaborative, and we always work together. So this was a joy to have you on Strictly Facts. Check out Silent Vibes, and I always hope that you guys enjoyed this episode. So till next time, little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspod.com for more information on each episode, and you can find all of our social media platforms there to stay connected.